Hi, this is Paul with Project Archipelago. I recently discovered Potholer54 on YouTube and have been enjoying his videos, many of which are aimed at debunking claims of those who argue against the conventional wisdom on climate change. Now, a few things were clear about Potholer right away that I really like. First, he really seems intent to boil everything down to evidence and reason. He avoids ad hominems. For instance, he refuses to use the derogatory term deniers, and is that ever refreshing? Instead, he uses the word critics. He exudes a genuine interest in getting things right. That is, he doesn't appear to be politically driven or out to validate a conclusion he's already established. He really seems genuinely open to argument. And I've got to say, I really like that picture because it just conveys this guy who's really kind of tired of debunking nonsense all the time, but just can't help himself. And that's kind of what comes across in his personality. Anyway, Potholer just uploaded a video called Top 10 Climate Myths, which I've linked below. Now, as I usually do, I listened with an ear to where and how the arguments would fit into the structure that we're promoting at Project Archipelago. And as a quick aside, I hope you'll explore our site to get the details on our alternative debate methodology that's under development, which focuses on argument construction rather than dialogue. So back to Potholer's video. Myth 2 is what really struck me and inspired the response you're watching now. First, look at how this is worded. Climate is always changing. And then in parentheses, therefore humans can't be responsible. Now, oddly enough, and I think Potholer would agree with this, the parenthetical is actually the myth, and the first statement is actually true. And this is where I would argue that Potholer unintentionally created a straw man. And I find this very interesting because my impression of Potholer is that the last thing he would do is intentionally straw man the arguments of those he sets out to critique. So let me break down what I think is the unintentionally constructed straw man argument into something like this. 1. Climate change occurred prior to industrialization. 2. Therefore, industrialization cannot be the cause of recent climate change. Now, as Potholer points out, this argument is garbage. Any critic making this argument would be confusing the concept industrialization can cause climate change with the concept industrialization is the only thing that can cause climate change. And that confusion makes the argument just as bad as the following, as Potholer had pointed out in an earlier video. Cancer existed before smoking was invented, therefore smoking cannot be the cause of recent cancer. Or this one, my room's been warmer than usual in the past, therefore the fire in my room cannot be the cause of the warmth I feel now. So yeah, this argument is stupid. And yes, this parenthetical is stupid. Here's the problem. I'm not aware of any serious critic ever making this argument. And please listen to my words carefully. I do agree that just about every serious critic I've ever heard will make the point that the climate has always changed and is always changing. Pretty much every public critic of the conventional wisdom on climate change says this, and it's usually one of the first things they say in any given presentation or debate. But again, I've never heard any of them say this. And sure enough, in the video, Potholer plays 3 examples of people saying this, but not one example of anyone saying this. So you're probably thinking, well, of course they're not going to come out and say it. That's why Potholer put it in parentheses. But you're thinking, obviously, this is the implication the critics are going for. If that's not the implication, then why would they make that first statement at all? Well, that's a feasible take as to what's going on. And it's exactly the kind of take that our echo chamber mentality tends to generate. But there is another possibility that I think is much more accurate. Imagine that you are a critic speaking to a general audience, and you believe that the audience has an implicit argument floating around in their minds. That argument looks something like this. 1. Prior to industrialization, the climate was relatively stable and calm. 2. Recently, the climate has been changing disruptively. 3. Aside from industrialization, not much has changed. And the conclusion 4, this strongly supports arguments that link disruptive climate change to industrialization. Now, I would argue that most lay people, your average person on the street, have something like this bouncing around in their mind. Of course, it's not formally constructed in this way, but if you ask most people who form their opinion from a diet of general media on this subject, This is the understanding they're carrying around. Most people have this idea. I don't know where they could have gotten it from. That the climate has been steady as she goes for all of human history, and then blam, climate change. So I think it's fair to argue that when critics say the climate is always changing to a general audience, what they're actually doing is seeking to rebut a key premise of that implicit argument. They're simply saying to the lay audience, hey, in case you've got the idea in your head that climate change is something new, let me relieve you of that misconception. And why would they do that? Well, because that premise supports the implicit conclusion, which biases the audience toward blaming industrialization for recent climate change. Plus, the critic is trying to get their foot in the door, persuasively speaking, by telling the audience, hey, everything you think you know about climate change might not be so. So in summary, here's what I think you've got. An implied argument exists out there as part of the conventional wisdom. A point is frequently made by critics that's aimed at undermining that implied argument. Potholer then takes that point without regard for the implicit argument that inspires it, and he implies an unstated conclusion, thereby constructing a strawman argument. And then, of course, he attacks that argument as fallacious, which it is, or would be if anyone was making it. Now, am I certain that this is what's happening? Well, I'm pretty close to certain. And does that make Potholer a bad guy? No, not at all. He seems like a great guy to me. In fact, he seems like one of the most honest voices out there on this topic on any side, and I really do appreciate that. I took this example specifically because Potholer is not a person you'd suspect of strawmanning. I took this example because, although I'm convinced this is a straw man, I'm also convinced that it isn't intentional. Could I have found examples from critics making similar mistakes? Hell yes. I can find dozens of examples of straw men, intentional and otherwise, in almost any presentation on this topic. I see examples everywhere, all over the internet, constantly. Some are obviously intentional and deceptive, but many are like this one. They are accidental straw men. Now, what this does for me is just reinforce the weaknesses in our current approaches to engaging one another in debate. It shows how we really lack the tools to explore and better understand our disagreements, even when we're trying to do that as earnestly and honestly as we possibly can. Well, that's what Project Archipelago is all about, and I hope you'll take a few minutes to explore the site and give me your feedback. For now, thanks for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and share, and have a great day.